Hello.
Hi, is this David?
Yes, it is.
All right, well, let me do the official introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very excited to welcome our next guest for this evening. He is one of the co-founders of Severin Films, and he's working with MPI Home Video on a fantastic brand new documentary that just came out, Master of Dark Shadows. We're very excited to welcome David Gregory to the show. You're on the air with Terry and Tiffany. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I remember the last time we talked to you in email, we were discussing coming on the show, and you were trying to get a deadline met and everything, and your DVD came out on April 16th. So first of all, congratulations for meeting the deadline.
Thank you.
And I'd like to find out, what is your experience with finding out about Dan Curtis? And of course, you've done this great DVD and documentary on him. But were you really a fan before? I mean, I don't even know how old you are. Did you grow up watching Dark Shadows, or did you catch it on the replay like a lot of younger generations?
Well, I didn't, because I grew up in England, and Dark Shadows didn't play in England. I actually discovered Dan Curtis through Burnt Offerings and the anthology film he did called Dead of Night.
Right.
They were the first two movies of his that I saw, and they both made a big impression on me. I probably saw them when I was like around 12, and loved them both. And subsequently, I think right after that, I saw the Jack Palance Dracula,
right,
and Trilogy of Terror, and the two features that the Dark Shadows features. I saw way before I ever saw an episode of Dark Shadows. And when I came to the US and was making special features for various companies, I was working with MPI a number of years ago and working on Henry and some of the other films that they had. And I said, when they were putting out all the DVDs of Dark Shadows, I said, you really should do a documentary about Dan Curtis, because he's kind of an unsung auteur in the horror genre, because a lot of his most famous work was TV. It wasn't feature film. And we talked about it back then, and this was before we made the feature film I made with them called Plague Town, and it was kind of forgotten about for a while. And then they came to me after I made Lost Soul, the documentary about the island of Dr. Moreau and Richard Stanley's disastrous production of that. And they came to me and said, "Hey, have you thought about doing a documentary on Dan Curtis and Dark Shadows?" I was like, "Yeah, we discussed this years ago." And they said, "We did," and and then so I'd already done my research at that point. They'd sent me a bunch of the DVDs, and I'd watched a number of the episodes, like hours and hours and hours of the Dark Shadows TV show, but I didn't actually see it until I was in my late 30s, early 40s.
Well, let me ask you, because Terry is an original Dark Shadows fan. He watched it growing up. I am Terry's daughter. Yep. I watched it on replay, reruns and things like that. Now, before I ever started watching the original Dark Shadows, I had seen other Dan Curtis projects. I had seen, Dracula, like you'd mentioned, Trilogy of Terror. Now, so for you, what was it like when you did go back and watch Dark Shadows? And don't get me wrong, I love Dark Shadows, but it takes a little bit of a stretch of imagination to go from something that was newer and more sleek, even something that was kind of like, Trilogy of Terror, to going back to Dark Shadows, which in a lot of ways, it was live TV, they had goofs, they had blunders, the fly trying to land on Barnabas's nose. Some people can appreciate it for that, and some people will sit down and say, well, this is silly. So how did you feel when you went back to watch it?
Well, I certainly didn't think it was silly, but I also was able to relate to the fact was something that I discovered when I started interviewing people about it. Was like, when this actually happened, when it came on air in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, I could imagine as a child who would have done anything to see any kind of vampire or werewolf or anything like that, any kind of, anything remotely supernatural, I would have absolutely soaked it up, and so it doesn't matter how hokey it is. I mean, when I look back at some of the stuff that we restore and put out on my label Severin Films now, some of it doesn't hold up quite as well as it was in my mind when I saw it as a teenager or a pre-teenager. But the fact is, when you're seeing, when you're into monsters and you're into horror and you're into that kind of stuff, you just would take anything, particularly when there wasn't that much of it about.
Right.
So can you imagine when when kids were, like, as everybody says, running home from school to watch this? It must have been something quite extraordinary.
I must say, too, it's interesting to me what was going on in your head, and you've explained a lot of it. But to know that you come to what is us, a foreign country. I mean, you come from England, and to know that you first saw House of Dark Shadows, and then they showed you the series, because the series is so much tamer than House of Dark Shadows. And I love that you brought that out in the documentary, talking about how they had said to Dan, well, Dan, you're not doing the guilty vampire anymore in House of Dark Shadows. And he's like, I know, we're not going to do that anymore. I mean, what was it like for you going from House of Dark Shadows and into the film? It didn't help to make you think it was hokey or anything, or it definitely is tamer.
Well, again, I could relate to it, because any time I saw something that was remotely horror related on British TV, it was, as I was growing up, it was right before, video, or the birth of video. So we weren't able to, just access, horror movies the way that we are now. So basically anything that, even if it was, some stupid comedy show that had a werewolf in it or something like that, I would have been excited by it, And we had Hammer House of Horror and Tales of the Unexpected and stuff like that. Yes. And I was very, very excited whenever there was something like that on, and the rest of the family wanted to watch, I don't know, Dallas or something like that. And I was like, no. This is only 1 hour a week, and it's only for a few, and I just want to see this kind of stuff. So, the fact that they actually took that chance to change this, gothic soap opera into something that featured vampires, that featured, supernatural elements. It makes perfect sense that it turned into something that really made an impression on people.
Right. Well, what did you think about? I've got to ask you. I know people are probably getting tired of this question by now, but to me, the Johnny Depp film was such a disaster. Okay, that's just an opinion I have. But I noticed in the documentary you're open to new things because you had the creator of True Blood. Now, that's a big difference from the Johnny Depp Dark Shadows film. But what did you think of the Johnny Depp Tim Burton Dark Shadows movie?
I didn't think it was very good, and I did the last. Actually, no, I quite like The Big Fish, but I often have Tim Burton discussions with people, and I was a big fan of Ed Wood, and I was a big fan of stuff before that, but it's a long time since Tim Burton has really, impressed me. So it's not just Dark Shadows. Like, if you look at Planet of the Apes, there's a lot of... Oh, sorry, I've got my dinner on. There's a lot of disappointing elements in Tim Burton's career, so it wasn't really a surprise that it didn't really deliver, even though he has this obvious love for Dark Shadows, and from what I understand, so does Johnny Depp, and so does Michelle Pfeiffer, and all these people. It just didn't really hit the mark.
Well, I must say,
but there are certain elements. There are certain films in Tim Burton's filmography that I'm very fond of. So I don't want to, just blanket put him down. But the fact is, he's made a lot of films that I think he's just kind of going through the motions.
Right. Recently, he needs to go back to old school, I guess. I don't know. He definitely did some great films. Dark Shadows wasn't one of them. But the only other incarnation that I do accept and do love, and it was one of Dan Curtis's last works, and I'm so happy you put this in a documentary, because everybody glosses over the Dark Shadows NBC series with Ben Cross.
From 91.
Not only do you highly feature it in a way, but you also have an interview with Ben Cross. Now, I thought he wanted nothing to do with Dark Shadows.
Yeah, and that was what I'd been led to believe as well. But no, as you see in the documentary, he says, not only am I happy to have done it, I'm absolutely proud of it.
Wow.
So it's always nice when that happens, and he was very keen to participate.
Now, another question I wanted to ask you, it kind of goes along with Terry asking about Ben Cross, but for listeners who haven't had a chance to see the documentary yet, it's very in-depth, and you get a chance to sit and chat with a lot of people who either seem to not want anything to do with it, or for a very long time didn't want to. Another one is Nancy Barrett. What was it like in the process of tracking all these people down, getting to sit down and interview with them, and how do you feel about going into a situation with someone like Nancy, who, I mean, she's kind of coming around again now, but for a very long time, she didn't want anything to do with Dark Shadows.
She made a statement on your documentary that at times she wished Dark Shadows would just go away. And that took me a little bit back.
And I run into that a lot. Like, I interview a lot of people about genre-related stuff that they did early in their career, which kind of defined their career. And they fight it for a long time, but then they sort of realize that, it's actually not that common that you get to do an iconic role that people appreciate years and years after it happens. So, it's nice when they come around and realize that that's something to actually be thankful for.
Yeah.
And Nancy Barrett was, as she says that in the documentary, as you say, she's basically like, she tried to distance herself from it for a while. But now that when we interviewed her, it was at the 50th anniversary, so she was there, and she was there meeting her fans, and she's still a little bemused as to why people are so into it. She doesn't quite get it, and she asked her fans, like, why are you so into this? But again, that happens a lot. Barbara Steele is another one. I mean, Barbara Steele is in the documentary. She's her context in the documentary is a producer of War and Remembrance and Winds of War, and so that's something that obviously she's very proud of in her career. But I've interviewed her before about the gothic horrors that she's well known for, that she made in Italy in the 60s with Mario Bava and Mariano Ciano, and a bunch of great Italian gothic horror directors that she just thought they were kind of these hokey films that she wasn't really even paying that much attention to while she was doing it. It was just work for her. And then all of a sudden she became this kind of horror icon of Italian cinema, and she's just like does not get it when she looks at these films.
I know, it just knocked me off the couch. I mean, I know that Dan Curtis received great accolades and awards for the Winds of War and War and Remembrance, but here is the Queen of Horror that's more proud of that than she was. Even being in Dark Shadows.
But Dan is the same, isn't he? Like, he says it at the end about how he wished he would be known for the epics that he did, but he's actually going to be remembered for Dark Shadows more than anything. And I would argue that he will also be remembered for the Zuni Doll episode of Trilogy of Terrors, more than anything. But because that's the thing that everybody remembers. But the fact is, you don't get to dictate that. When you make a work of art, the thing that resonates is the thing that you're going to be remembered for. And it's the same with Barbara. And Barbara's ultimately come around as well. She now talks about these gothic horrors that she made. She is also bemused that, people like the fans, when she meets them, know so much more about her involvement in these movies than she does, that she finds it a bit weird, but she was obviously very good in them, so she can't fight that.
Now, you're obviously a big horror fan, not only talking to you, but based on all the stuff that you produce, movies and documentaries alike. I would assume your DVD is pretty much aimed at the genre fan. But I needed to get this in because we got a few emails, and everybody said they loved your DVD, loved your documentary, but they wished you would have paid a little less time or did a little less footage on the Winds of War and War and Remembrance, even though it was so damned important to Dan's life. And why did you seem to gloss over a little bit on Trilogy of Terror and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Kolchak and Night Stalker?
I would love to have gone into detail about those other films that he did. As I say, Dead of Night and Burnt Offerings were the first films that I saw of his, and I loved them. Uh-huh. But the fact was, when MPI contacted me to do this, they wanted to do a history of Dark Shadows. Mm-hmm. And I said we need to bring in the biography of Dan Curtis because there's more to Dan Curtis than this, and so it ended up being that. But we didn't end up going into each and every film in that much detail because Dark Shadows was the focus of the documentary. Dark Shadows was the thing that they wanted to concentrate on.
Right.
Well, let me kind of ask you to play off of that. And this was something that I know, of course, from being a Dark Shadows fan, that MPI is very ingrained with Dark Shadows. Obviously, they were the ones that released Dark Shadows on home video and all that kind of thing. But I was wondering, when I had first heard about this documentary, I was thinking, well, why doesn't David just release it on Severin Films? And then when I figured out that it was being released through MPI, I had thought, well, maybe MPI has some kind of a stake in the Dark Shadows name, but do they, or is that still owned by the Dan Curtis estate?
They both together. Dan Curtis Productions and MPI have had an arrangement for years with their distribution of Dark Shadows. So I think that was kind of the impetus for doing this in the first place, and why it was probably Dark Shadows oriented. It was something that they wanted to make for the Dark Shadows fans, the very loyal Dark Shadows fans. So it was something that was a tribute to Dan, obviously, and a tribute to Dark Shadows. And I although they do distribute also the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Dracula and some of the other Dan Curtis films, I don't believe they have the entire filmography of Dan Curtis that they distribute. So maybe that had something to do with it.
Yeah, I actually thought of that too. I wasn't even aware that they had the rights to the two you mentioned, Dr. Jekyll and that. But I figured in my head they probably didn't have the rights to Kolchak and probably didn't have the rights to a lot of the other ones. So you're working for MPI. I mean, you were contracted by them. You can't really do something they wouldn't let you do. So even though you're your own filmmaker and your own company,
I mean, it's not like they put me in a coffin and said you have to do it this way. But the commission was definitely to do a history of Dark Shadows, and we ended up broadening it to make it the biography of Dan that goes along with Dark Shadows. But it was definitely needed to be Dark Shadows centric.
Well, at least you mentioned the others, because I'm telling you, there's not a lot of people that knows Trilogy of Terror, Dan Curtis connection. Okay, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that movie, but they don't know. And you mentioned it. So
MPI did release a DVD of Trilogy of Terror some years ago. I think they lost the rights to it, but I did do an interview with Karen Black and with Richard Matheson for that DVD. So we did actually cover that on that DVD. So, if that was something that they wanted to go into detail with in the documentary, then we would have been able to use that archival footage. But like I say, I think they wanted to keep it mainly centered on Dark Shadows.
Well, I appreciate your comments. You had some very good answers. I think you answered everybody's questions. I mean, that was really the only criticism I've heard. Everybody's loved it, except they wanted more of the other, and hope that someday you can put out another edition. But the one thing I must say about the DVD, in my opinion, is that it's honest, and you did not soft soap the fact that while Dan Curtis was a genius, he was fucking scary. I mean, we had Sharon Smith, who played little Sarah Collins on the show, Barnabas' sister, and I asked her, I'm like, how much do you remember about Dan Curtis? She said all she can remember is hearing him yell at people down the hallway. And you talk about that. like some of the cast, Laura Parker said she was definitely afraid of him, and you don't soft soap it. You tell it like it is, right?
Yeah, no, I mean that was part of who Dan Curtis was. I mean, he was the leader. He was very alpha male. He was somebody who did things his way, and if it wasn't going his way, he would have made sure that it ended up being his way. It was that kind of thing. But again, it was like, when you talk about a lot of artists and directors of that era, it seems that seems to have been the way. Yeah. That's how they got stuff done. And to me, it's something that I don't work that way, but but a lot of people ended up respecting. Like William Nolan, for example, loved it. He said, sometimes in those story sessions it would get scary, but at the end of the day, you got out of those sessions exactly what you needed to get. And so he didn't walk away like being scared or thinking he was bullied or anything like that. He came out of it thinking, we got done what we needed to get done. So there's definitely a logic to it.
Dan may have had a lot of teeth like a shark, but he was a pussycat. Yeah. Okay, I know he was a pussycat because I don't want to tell everything on the DVD, but I just got to tell people my favorite story. Of course, Dan Curtis started out doing what was it, CBS Golf Classic? It was a golf show for network television. And I guess because of him pushing his weight around, he was banned from the set, and he cried. And this is that scary man, and he cried. Right. And there you go. Both sides of Dan Curtis. And I thought you revealed that well. I thought you really covered that well. So.
Yeah, I had to actually argue to keep that in because I did think that showed this very human side to Dan. That he didn't like other people to see. He didn't like to see his sensitivity. But obviously it was there. And people discuss that as well. I mean, the fact that he was so into, Gothic literature and romance and things like that, it's there, even though he didn't show it. He liked to, burst into a room and be, overpowering and you'll do as I say. But there was definitely a side to him that, was the guy who made Dark Shadows.
Right.
Well, one of the other things I wanted to mention that I thought was great that you did a very good job of capturing in the documentary is the fanfare, the fandom, the craze that was happening around it. I mean, we've interviewed quite a few members of the Dark Shadows cast, and we've even had, articles and our interviews printed with them in national magazines. And I remember Terry had words with someone at one point because Terry had said the exact same things that you said in the documentary, and that was, I used to run home from school every day to watch Dark Shadows. And there was other people that was like, well, it was on after school, and I don't know what you're talking about. But it was such a phenomenon and a craze. And then you went into the thing with, the teen magazines and the toys and all of that kind of stuff. So do you think that since Dark Shadows, has there been anything that has impacted kind of that young demographic? And oddly enough, housewives the same as Dark Shadows.
That crossover seems to be a very unique crossover.
Yeah.
But it came out of the fact that it started as a soap opera and then became a supernatural show. So, and then all of a sudden kids were interested in what probably would have been boring to them before that. So, I mean, that's one of the things that gives it its longevity is the fact that it's unique, and that whole running home from school thing is something that people that just this weekend at Monster Palooza, I was at the Severin table, and somebody bought Master of Dark Shadows for their mother. And it was like, guess what? She used to run home from school. I was like, yeah, that's what everybody says. Right. That sounds like a cliche, but no, apparently that was what everybody did.
Now, see, I didn't know
it was a big deal.
I didn't know before you come on that you were British, and I'm so proud that you're raising the flag for our American show, and not once did you mention Doctor Who.
Well, it's funny because you say that the running home from school in Dark Shadows for Doctor Who, it's hiding behind the settee. It was basically you hide behind the couch, but we actually did that. Me and my sisters used to pull the couch away from the wall to watch Doctor Who from behind the couch. I don't know why. That was something that everybody did. It was definitely something to be scared, but as opposed to, like, I don't know, putting a cushion in front of your face or something. No, we actually hid behind the couch. So that was just something you did.
Well, I'm telling everybody, if you want to find out, it's about time, because without Dan Curtis, there would be no Dark Shadows.
Right.
And it's about time somebody went into in-depth and telling people about Dan the Man, as I call him, what he was like and who he was and everything. And, you know, I appreciate you doing this, and so thankful to find out things in your DVD, and specifically to find out that it's Dark Shadows and not Shadows on the Wall, because it was supposed to originally be called Shadows on the Wall. And if you want to know just great information like that,
well, I've got to say, I was very fortunate that I was working with producer Jim Pearson, who is the guy who knows more about Dark Shadows and Dan Curtis's career than anybody, more than Dan knew, and he was the one who was able to come up with all these details that probably have not been, you know, written in, you know, articles and things like that. So he was the one that when something came up like that, he was like, not only was it based on that episode of The Web, I have that episode of The Web, so we were able to show a clip from that, right. You know, and so to have that kind of resource when you're making a documentary like this is, you know, is definitely raises it up a level.
Right. Well, we want to encourage all of our listeners. I know that we have quite a few Dark Shadows fans that listen to us, and they have to be, because we have, you know, actors from Dark Shadows on at least once or twice a year. So we want to encourage all of them to check out the documentary. We watched it just the other night. It is fantastic. It is called Master of Dark Shadows.
He is the Master of Dark Shadows.
Curtis, of
Damn
course.
Right.
And David, where can they get copies? Is it just off the MPI website? Is it on Amazon and things like that yet? I know it just came out.
It's on Amazon. Anywhere you can order Blu-rays from, it's available. In the United States, at least. It's not available overseas yet, because it's going to play a couple of festivals before it comes out overseas. But it's available on Blu-ray and Amazon and Diabolic and all the places where you can buy Blu-rays. That's where you get it.
Perfect. Just came out April 16th. Everybody check it out. David, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And before we go ahead and give a plug for anything else you'd like to in regards to what are you working on currently with Severin, and where can people catch up with the projects you're doing with Severin Films?
Yeah, if anyone wants to follow Severin Films on Facebook and social media, we have all manner of weird and wonderful horror and genre content coming out on Blu-ray restored in special editions. We just bought out a box set of Hemisphere horrors of films like The Blood Drinkers and Curse of the Vampires and Brain of Blood. And I'm just finishing up another documentary about the life and death of Al Adamson, who was the director of Satan's Sadists and Dracula vs. Frankenstein.
Yeah. Which is my favorite movie. Dracula vs. Frankenstein is the best movie ever made.
Yeah. There you go. So we're basically just finishing up a feature documentary on Al Adamson's life. It's like we've got everybody who is still alive. In fact, a couple of people who are no longer with us who are in this documentary. And of course, Al unfortunately met a very tragic end at the hands of his handyman and ended up being buried underneath his jacuzzi. So he has a very kind of lurid end to his life, but he also had an incredible life of making these low-budget B movies through the 60s and 70s. So it's a lot of fun, and we're just coming to the end of making that as well. So that's going to be the next documentary.
And I know MPI had it for a while, but whoever has, the rights to the Night Stalker, whether it be the 2 TV movies or the series, I'm asking them to get a hold of you.
I think they just came out through Kino, actually. They just came out on Blu-ray.
Well, Kino should get a hold of you, because I want you seriously, and I'm getting this call from everybody, please tell him, do a documentary on Kolchak the Night Stalker, the films and the series. That would be awesome.
Yeah. Well.
All right. Well, I want to thank you also, David, just because it's, in working in our genre, it's companies like Severin and Arrow Films and people like that actually keep these horror and drive-in and B movies alive, and that is very important to what we do here at Cult Radio, so thank you for that.
Well, that's what we love.
Yes. All right, again, the documentary is called Master of Dark Shadows, and check it out, pick it up, and David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, have a great rest of your weekend.
Bye-bye.
All right, you too.
All right,
bye-bye.
bye-bye.